Before you put that on, that was a very exciting talk, and I have some quite exciting questions as well. Vamos começar com a pergunta da praticalidade do anarcocapitalismo, da praticalidade das leis privadas. Eu tenho duas perguntas aqui. Por que o anarcocapitalismo ainda não surgiu? Os Estados nacionais impedem o surgimento de concorrência? Como levar o anarcocapitalismo para a realidade? Essa pergunta do Rafael Gutmann. E como se poderia também, na mesma linha, como se poderia implantar tal sistema de leis privadas, levando em consideração que o governo tende a não abrir mão do seu direito de legislar?
Yeah, that's a good set of questions, and I think my son spent an hour or so giving his answers to those questions in effect. And in a sense, he's really following on a line of argument that I made 30-some years ago. I think revolution is usually a poor policy, that as the world now is, the real reason people want government is so they won't be murdered in their beds, and therefore the more chaos you have, the more support there is for strong government. So I think the right strategy is one that involves in some way privately developing alternatives to government, sort of gradually replacing government rather than overthrowing government. So that from that standpoint, 40 or 50 years ago, if somebody suggested that we don't really need a government post office, most people would say that's absurd. The mail wouldn't get delivered. Nowadays, when somebody says that, you say, by the way, where did you get that UPS package from? Because we now have several private firms which are competing with the post office successfully in part of its activities and are not competing it in the other activities because it's against the law to compete with it in the direct delivery of mail. So that example, it seems to me, helps people be less supportive of the kind of policies that I'm opposing. Similarly, there has been a considerable development in the U.S. of gated communities where you have a housing development where, in effect, protection is being provided privately, not publicly. There's a lot of commercial arbitration where people are essentially avoiding the court system in order to use private courts. So I think that one route in the direction I'm proposing is the continual development of substitutes, especially for things governments do very badly, so that people will find that although the government is still doing something, they're not really using the government anymore. Similarly, homeschooling and private schooling, the more people are sending their children to non-government schools, the less the political support for government schools. So, one could go into a long discussion here. But I think that's one path. There is another very different path, which interests me partly because I'm interested in technologies and their effects on the world. And if you read my most recent book, which is called Future Imperfect, and which is a book about technological revolutions that may be happening and their implications, one possibility is for an online world that government has very little control over. That there are technologies now known involving encryption which would make possible a cyberspace, an online world, where an individual could combine anonymity with reputation, in which I can prove to someone else online that I'm the same person he interacted with yesterday, so I can have a reputation. But I do not have to tell anybody at all what the link is between the online identity and the real space identity. And it is very hard to tax or regulate somebody if you do not know who he is. So in that world, one could imagine the development of something like anarcho-capitalism, probably using only reputational enforcement, because I also can't send my goons to pick up my television set if I don't know who he is. But I can use ways of telling other people in cyberspace that he's not to be trusted if he has violated a contract with me. And there are technologies available by which I can prove to other people that he violated a contract with me. And this involves the use of digital signatures, which I discuss. So if you read the early chapters of Future Imperfect, which you can do for free because it's on my website as well as being published, that will suggest a possible technological future in which governments continue to control real space. They continue to control the physical reality, but more and more of people's lives is being lived in cyberspace, and in which cyberspace could end up as something rather like the kind of anarcho-capitalism I'm describing. So that's a different answer to the same question. And of course the third answer is the one that Patri gave you a little while ago. I am a little less optimistic than he is. I think that, like most radical ideas, his will probably fail. But there is some chance that it will succeed, and if it succeeds, it could have very attractive results.
Agora temos conjunto de perguntas similares. Eu vou ler todas elas. Como esse sistema de arbitragem, através de agentes privados, poderia solucionar com neutralidade questões que envolvessem partes com capacidade econômica distintas? Afinal, ainda que possamos discordar, o Estado é supostamente neutro para tratar esses conflitos. As melhores agências tenderiam a ser contratadas pela parte mais rica. Essa pergunta foi anônima. Agora uma pergunta do Daniel Kuhn, na mesma linha.
Let me do one
Okay.
at a time. Do we observe that more money is spent building Cadillacs or building Fords? That is to say, I think it is a mistake to suppose that private firms only specialize in the rich. There aren't enough rich. So I assume that a private firm is happy to sell a service which includes special guards at a high price to a rich person, and a service which only provides an ordinary level of protection to a non-rich person. But if the arbitration agencies consistently rule against my customers in favor of your customers, I am going to stop agreeing to use that agency. So I don't see there's any reason to expect it. Furthermore, I think the idea that government is neutral does not, as we say in English, pass the giggle test. I don't know how many people have been paying attention to U.S. politics, but there is at least one respect in which Obama is consistent, and that is that anything he wants to do that costs more money, he says the rich are going to pay for. I'm not sure it's true. I'm not saying he's consistent in what he does, but he's consistent in what he says. And that's perfectly normal, that, of course, politicians will appeal, I'm not just saying only the rich. Some politicians would say, those other people over there will pay for it, or only the criminals will pay for it, or only the illegal immigrants will. It doesn't matter what group, but governments are never neutral. And part of the difference, fundamental difference between governments and markets, is that in a market, the most I can do to you is not to deal with you. In a political system, I can hurt you much worse than that. I can put you in jail, I can kill you, or I can just take money from you. So there's a sense in which the political system is almost automatically a war of each against all, to use Hobbes' term, because you've got a sort of fixed cake out there and we're fighting over the pieces. In the market, what I am doing if I want to make money is not fighting over pieces, it's trying to produce some more cake and sell it to someone. And that is a very much less divisive project. I'm not arguing there are never any conflicts. Obviously, I would like Apple to make exactly the computers I want. I have my list of desires for the next cell phone, and if HTC refuses to follow them, I will be unhappy. But nonetheless, they aren't making me worse off. They just may or may not be making me as much better off as I wish they would. It has, by the way, a 5-inch screen, if anybody wants to design the next cell phone for me. And unlike Dell's 5-inch screen, it does not run on the AT&T network.
Uma pergunta do Daniel Kuhn, que é da OAB do Rio Grande do Sul. E o que ocorreria com aquelas pessoas que não possam pagar por uma law enforcement firm, não a sua integridade física e sua propriedade não seria violada?
Maybe. To begin with, the people who can't pay don't have very much property to violate. So the incentive to steal from someone who has nothing is not very high. Beyond that, I presume that if there are some very, very impoverished people in a decent society, there will be other people who are willing to contribute to give them some minimal level of protection. Just as I expect that without government, you would still not see people starving in the streets. Because in societies, at least like ours, in relatively rich societies, almost everybody has enough to feed many people, and if there are a few people who are in really serious need, someone is likely to help them. I think that's the evidence of the past and is likely to be true in the future. But in general, one of the standard arguments for government is that it redistributes income. And one of the standard arguments against is that it frequently redistributes it perversely. That is, it quite often redistributes from the poor to the rich, as well as sometimes from the rich to the poor. And that whichever direction it's redistributing it in, it is usually a very expensive process, so that what one side gets is a lot less than what the other side loses. That could be a long argument. It's an interesting argument. I'm not claiming that it's obviously right, but I think that's part really of the general argument for or against laissez-faire, not anything special to the argument for laissez-faire and rights protection. Because after all, not having police protection is pretty bad, but not having food is worse. And in a ordinary free market society with the government, still it's the private market that's producing the food.